secure, and for that reason we want it to become a traded service, so we can actually sell our services to other councils, bring income in and make sure that money is put back into learning disability services.
Is this really what it's come to? A process of robbing Peter to pay Paul all the time and hoping that Peter doesn't shout too loud?
It's about being innovative with your services. The government is saying look at shared services. We're also looking at traded services to look at what we can sell to other organisations and other councils. We're looking at different delivery models to get our costs down. There's simply not enough money to do everything we've always done in the same way. That is not possible, and we've got to make sure in the fairest way possible we can ensure that those services for vulnerable people are protected and delivered in the most cost-effective way possible.
OK, we've got representatives from, as you'll appreciate, the three main political parties on the City of York Council, live with us around the table. Live, I think, yes, they're all looking fairly live at the moment still. We can also hear, I'm pleased to say, from the Green Party this morning. I've been talking to Councillor Andy de Gorn. He's the leader of the Green Party group on the City of York Council, who gave me his thoughts on the budget proposals and the cuts that will be involved.
Well, I think firstly we would say that these are government-imposed cuts quite clearly, although the Labour government wasn't proposing anything significantly different before it lost power. But having said that, obviously the council has to balance its books. But what we are saying is that the £1 million fund which the Labour group is proposing, a delivery and innovation fund, should actually be used to try and mitigate some of the worst of the cuts that are still going to take place.
That innovation fund is there for a point, though, isn't it? It is about innovation. It's about making the city new. It's about bringing in jobs. It's about fresh thinking and new ideas. And that is where the city's future lies.
Most certainly, and there are other ways of doing it rather than aligning the council budget. And we do feel that the council is cutting the support to the voluntary sector. It's cutting the work it does in neighbourhoods, which is exactly where we should be putting the emphasis in terms of supporting new ways of working rather than a specifically earmarked fund for the leader to decide on his own how he's going to spend it.
What sort of impact do you think the type of cuts that the administration is proposing is going to have on the quality of life of people in the city? Well,
we're particularly concerned about the privatisation of services for the elderly, for the vulnerable in the city. That is something which, albeit it might not have been the first choice of the Labour administration, but that is something they're pushing through as a way of making savings, which will impact on staff morale, on the quality of the service, and on the overall quality of provision within the city.
Do you accept they have very little choice, though? I mean, these cuts are imposed. This £20 million, this latest round of cuts, £20 million over 2 years, is something over which the administration has no control. It has to do it, and somebody's going to suffer somewhere down the line somehow.
Well, certainly, and we do support the decision of the Labour group to increase council tax this year, because without that increase, we would be actually moving into an even worse position in a year's time. So we do support increasing council tax in order to try and mitigate some of those cuts. But having said that, they are making choices which will impact on the most vulnerable. It's quite clear that that's the case, even though they might be trying their best to avoid that.
That's leader of the Green Group on the City of York Council, Councillor Andy de Gorn. Again, a question really, I think, aimed at you, James, this morning. It's always going to be the way, isn't it, as leader of the controlling group. Has he got a point? Again, saying that he's fearful that the most vulnerable people are going to suffer, and that you have this budget, this £1 million innovation fund, over which you are able to sort of effectively sign off £100,000 at a time, when there appear to be many other good calls on that sort of money.
Yeah, let me explain that budget. In 1997, there was set up by the council a thing called the Venture Fund. It was an amount of money that was actually used to be able to create capacity for changes in service delivery and so on, and it was used towards finding schemes to be able to save money longer term, such as the West offices and so on. The rules surrounding the expenditure of that was that the leader or officers could sign off £100,000, and has been for the last 10 years or so. Now, what's happened is we have said we need to have some funds to be able to look at how do we turn libraries into social social enterprises, how do we try and transfer our services into different service deliveries to be able to reduce costs? And therefore we have to put funding and capacity in to be able to do that. And that will include funding into the voluntary sector if they're going to take on board some services. It's going to include funding into setting up co-ops and so on, and that's what that money's for. Without that money, you can't just turn a switch and say this service is now a different form of delivery and it will save to the taxpayer. What you will end up doing instead is saying we won't do it anymore, and therefore it's an extra cut.
Let's see what Carol and Ian have to say about that. Is James wise to be keeping this £1 million back in order to achieve what he's just described?
Well, I think rather than an innovation fund, which and venture fund, and nobody would disagree that the will to make venture funds available for any ventures. I think it could also turn into a vanity fund as well, in as much as that the venture fund, my understanding of it was it always went through cabinet or executive as it was.
James, are you going to spend this on your pet project for vanity reasons?
Ian's understanding is wrong. There's already been those powers for a number of years for the leader or an officer to sign off £100,000 of expenditure. What we've done is just said clearly in the paper those powers already exist, and every expenditure over £5,000 is registered on the council's website. Anyone can see it, anyone can scrutinise it.
I think the worry here is that James can have the £100,000 to spend on anything that he wants without any reference to his cabinet colleagues. It goes hand in glove with another proposal that all the cabinet making decision sessions are made in private, not in public. And it always, is the trust with each other within the cabinet. I mean, who knows? The situation is it could well be a vanity fund. I'm not for 1 minute saying that James is going to build a statue of Gordon Brown on Usbridge, but he could do. But the situation is, as far as I'm concerned, let's have it open, and before it goes, let it be scrutinised if necessary before the decision's made. That power's going to be taken away.
If that's the case, why in 2008, I think it is, did you increase, through your amendment to the budget, the expenditure on the venture fund by £100,000 and gave the leader of the council that exact same power without making those same points?
The whole thing was at that stage it came through executive.
No, it didn't.
It didn't go through his own.
Before we disappear down a plug hole of council procedures and council discussions, I want to say that someone else has joined us in the studio this morning, because one sector that could be affected, probably will be affected one way and another by funding cuts, is the voluntary sector. We've already talked about those people who are vulnerable. A lot of our conversation has already revolved around that this morning. The young, the elderly, those with particular needs. Well, Angela Harrison is the Chief Executive of York CVS, and she's kindly joined us in the studio this morning. Good morning.
Good morning.
Nice to have you with us. What are your concerns about the budget as it is proposed at the moment?
Well, picking up on the points that have just been discussed about the voluntary sector perhaps looking at how it can work with the local authority to deliver new and innovative services at lower cost, then the point I would like to make is that in order to do that, we actually have to have some capacity, and organisations have to be robust and able to look at how they can deliver those new services.
What does capacity mean? Just unpack that word for us. Does it mean money?
It means to be able to have the time to be able to set up new projects and do things, and time costs money. And our concern is that there is a proposal in the budget to take another £100,000 away from core grants to voluntary sector organisations. So there's a little bit of a contradiction there, that to take money away but at the same time to want to work with us to develop new ideas, it does make that difficult.
James, you take it away with one hand but demand more or ask more of the voluntary sector on the other. It's crazy.
Well, I don't deny that that's how it looks in terms of the budget, but in terms of the savings, the voluntary sector for their core services are not immune from the cuts. We can't do that. And what we have tried to do is keep those cuts down to a minimum. The cuts to the Museums Trust and Theatre Royal are far higher than they are to other core voluntary sector organisations. However, the Innovation Fund that I just mentioned is supposed to be there to create that capacity that Angela is saying is required.
I think there's a difference here. I mean, at last year's budget, we put an amendment in that gave £100,000 to the voluntary sector, because I'm aware that investment in there can produce a return that can be anything from fivefold upwards in terms of the spend. And so therefore what we did, we put the £100,000 that James and his colleague voted against last year into the budget, so that the voluntary sector, or the York CVS in particular, could spend that money in order to return to upskill or whatever that they decided was the best way to spend it. It was unfettered by a lot of paperwork. Now, from what I can gather, not all that budget has been spent in the last year by this administration. Now, you question that, and you question what they're trying to do here, and it becomes a little bit smoke and mirrors here.
Okay, bit of smoke and mirrors. Let's see what Angela has to say about that. Do you feel that you are being asked to do too much with very little?
I think none of us envy the decisions that have got to be made about the budget this year. However, there is an issue of scale, and the scale for the voluntary sector is very, very small. To take £100,000 out of our budget, it makes a tremendous difference. I'll just give you a comparison. One of the lines in the budget...
Can I just ask, is what Ian just said, do you agree with that you invest £100,000 in the voluntary sector, you get about £500,000 worth out of it because you are the voluntary sector?
Well, the national research shows that it's anywhere between £4 and £14 return on every pound you spend with the voluntary sector. So that's proven research that's available. So I do agree that to spend with the voluntary sector does make a massive return on investment.
Right, and how are you going to achieve what the City Council wants you to achieve without the money that you've previously had? I
don't think we can. I think we're willing to work with the local authority to look at how we can help deliver new solutions, but there has to be a recognition that that costs money. And by taking away core grants to voluntary organisations, that gives them just that little bit of money to underpin their day-to-day costs, then it does make it difficult to be innovative and to do new and exciting work.
Just in practical terms, so that people can visualise what we're talking about here. We talk about in these broad sweeping terms of the voluntary sector and this, that and the other. What type of things might actually be affected day to day for people living in the City of York?
I think it's any service that a voluntary organisation provides where they interact direct with the public. So, for example, organisations that give advice on debt counselling, people who've got money troubles and need to talk to Citizens Advice Bureau and organisations like that, people who want advice on housing issues and homelessness. We see people every day who want to volunteer in order to be able to improve their job chances. Now, that costs money to be able to have them meet somebody who can advise them and give them help and support.
So, and do you feel that all of that is being eroded? What is going to be the level of impact? I know it's difficult to sort of project, but are we going to see what type of damage, for want of a better loaded expression, are cutbacks going to do to the voluntary sector?
I think it's very difficult to tell at this stage because we haven't got the level of detail about which organisations in particular will be most affected. But all I would say is that any amount of money like £100,000 that you remove from our sector has a massive impact.
Does the knowledge that James has this fund up his sleeve, this £1 million fund that he and his senior... Sorry, not on your sleeve, all right, but basically it's like your back pocket.
Got about a £5 in my pocket.
But you've got £1 million in your back pocket that you can spend when you need to on particular projects that need help. Is that going to be the sort of thing that can help out the voluntary sector?
It's about rebalancing that relationship. All of the funding that the council gives to external organisations, we have to look at now very seriously and say, is this fitting the priorities that the city require? We can't just give funding to organisations, whether they're voluntary or not, or other organisations, simply saying because we always have done. We're not in that position. So this is about now saying, what are those priorities, how will that funding be allocated in a targeted way, and also what capacity can be built in those external organisations to take on board council services and be able to deliver them at a cheaper price. The voluntary sector is a core part of that.
Do you find that at all reassuring?
I think I'd like to see some more information about the fund and make sure that some of the smaller organisations who might be able to take part can be supported to take part, because a lot of them at the moment are just very busy running around trying to secure their day-to-day costs. So we have to make sure that they're able to get involved.
Angela, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Let me just bring in Carol Runciman here, who's got something to say.
This is a very important area indeed, and we have to remember that last year James and his colleagues said they wouldn't make those sort of cuts when the budget was being discussed, and this year they've done exactly that. So that is a broken promise.
I didn't say that.
We need to remember that voluntary organisations need to know what's coming. There's a lot of people in there who volunteer, but there are also people that are employed to help and support those volunteers. And as I understand it, and Angela will say whether it's so or not, the voluntary organisations didn't find out until too late what was likely to happen to them. And for me, that's wrong. Everything needs to be open, everything needs to be above board, everything needs to be told to the people who most matter. And for me, the voluntary organisations of the work they do is something that really matters.
Briefly, Ian Gillis?
Yeah, I think the difference between James and ourselves, as we had discussions with Angela and her colleagues last year, and we were prepared to give her that money because they run a professional organisation. The CVS is an excellent organisation, and we were quite confident that given that money, totally unfettered, that they would produce what were required from it. And it's a question of trust. If James can't trust them, then that's his problem. You don't have to have your finger in every single pie.
It's not a matter of trust. It's a matter of what savings are therefore to the taxpayer receive from that funding, and there has to be evidence for that. And I was concerned that there wasn't evidence for that, so therefore we need to look at how do we develop that relationship, how can we use the innovation funds to make sure those priorities are set and that the voluntary sector can be a part of that.
OK, we've got just a matter of about 4 minutes left and quite a lot of questions and comments coming in. Angela Harrison, thank you very much indeed for joining us this morning. Good to see you. Doubtless we'll speak again in future. On the phones, we've had a call from a listener asking why the council, James, continues to pay for the work of trade union officials. £123,000 for 2 union officials a year. Why don't the unions pay their own officials rather than the public actually pay for pay for union officials' time?
It's the Trade Unions Relations Consolidation Act of 1992 under the Major government, which protects the rights to be able to have union conveners and to give them time off in lieu, and that's what it's paid for. The amount of money that's spent on that now is exactly the same as it has been for the last 8 years under the previous administration, and also on top of that, that money, which is £143,000, saves this year £250,000 to the taxpayer through negotiation with the trade unions. I would say on a business case, that's a good deal.
Fair and reasonable, you two?
No, not really. I think James...
Well, James says you did it.
James is obviously controlled to a certain degree by the unions. In the same way as they've changed an office at the top of the shambles to give to the unions and thrown one of the
to get them out of another office that was costing more money.
All right, we'll leave that one there before it turns into just a slanging match. On the text this morning, David says it's time for an urgent root and branch review of all council services and staffing levels, remuneration packages, together with levels of elected representation. He says it's time for all local government to become more affordable and to stop constantly milking council taxpayers with too many excessive precept hikes since 1997.
Yeah.
So he's not just pointing a finger at the current administration, he's pointing the finger at past administrations. And Andy Goodall says that it seems to me to be another government attack on the worst off, diverting us from the corporation tax dodgers and the top earners. Well, there's some comfort for all sides there, I should think. James perhaps agreeing more with the second point than with the first. Let us just hear something about the mood in the council at the moment and what's actually happening. We've been hearing at breakfast time here on Radio York this morning about the stress facing council staff in York at the moment and the impact that's having on morale. This is what Andrea Dudding from Unison had to say about the way that this is affecting people.
At the last wellbeing event at the Guildhall at the end of January, we did see more members coming to us expressing that they were feeling